Welcome to Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Good to have you all with us. Well, what were our takeaways from last night's Democratic debate in Iowa? Clearly, CNN and the media and political establishment have it in for Bernie Sanders. They don't want him to win, and he's soaring in the polls, all the while lobbing softballs and not challenging Joe Biden all evening. In post-debate discussions, it seems that there is a sizable debate going on because of what happened between Sanders and Warren. And it seems to be affecting many young progressives who are torn about this issue. We'll cover that as well. Medicare for All was under attack last night, and there were clear differences around that, but overall, they did not attack one another. It seemed about getting their point across to see who's going to win in Iowa. That would seem to be the major push from these candidates. So where does this take us on some of the major issues? And how important is this debate last night in Iowa for the Democrats in taking on Trump? Can they beat Trump? Well, we'll figure all that out for you, and more, maybe. We're here with Dr. Kimberly Moffitt, who's professor and chair of language, literacy, and culture at UMBC. She's a media critic who covers politics and pop culture. She's co-author of The Obama Effect and the forthcoming volume, FLOTUS Effect, Reflections on Platform Presence and Agency of Michelle Obama. And we're also joined by Luke Savage, who is staff writer at Jacobin Magazine, who wrote an interesting piece today for Jacobin on last night's debate and also contributes to current affairs. And folks, welcome. Good to have you both with us.
Thank you.
Good to be back.
Good to have you back. Good to have you both back. So let's start with this portrait of Bernie Sanders and the questions he got from some of the press there.
Senator Sanders, in the wake of the Iran crisis, Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei has again called for all U.S. troops to be pulled out of the Middle East, something you've called for as well. Yet when American troops last left Iraq, ISIS emerged and spread terror across the Middle East and indeed around the world.
Senator Sanders, your campaign proposals would double federal spending over the next decade, an unprecedented level of spending not seen since World War II. How would you keep your plans from bankrupting the country?
No, our plan wouldn't bankrupt the country, and in fact, it would much improve the well-being of working-class families and the middle class.
So it really did seem to me that the focus of CNN questioners was on Bernie Sanders and trying to push him as hard as they could and kind of to stem the tide for Bernie that seems to be growing in Iowa. So what's your take? I mean, Kimberly, let me start with you. I know you wrote this piece. We're going to come right to you about that in a second. But let me start with Kimberly and just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's a reason why the hashtag CNN is garbage and CNN is fake news was trending this morning, which I think speaks to quite a bit of how CNN chose to frame its questions. And it did seem a bit one-sided in terms of the way they were framing questions and the hard-hitting questions they had for Sanders, while others seemed to be able to slide away a little easier in terms of the responses that they were required to offer. And
Luke, it seemed also to me when you watched this, and we read your piece this morning, that there's a surge, that Bernie is surging at the moment in Iowa and around the country. And after this was over, he raised 43% of all the money pledged last night after the debate among Democrats. So clearly people are worried about Bernie Sanders, the person who talks about democratic socialism, surging in the polls and what that might mean. So talk about your analysis from that.
Yeah, well, I predicted last week in a piece for Jacobin that the media was finally coming around to the possibility that Sanders might actually win the Democratic nomination, which is, something that I think some of us have thought he's been well positioned to for the last year, but it's something they're only just coming around to. And that, given that fact, we were probably due for a backlash of pretty epic proportions, because a candidate with Sanders politics coming this close to a major party nomination is basically unprecedented in American history. And it was just days after that that piece came out that began a media cycle. It's been kind of this ceaseless deluge of negative press for Sanders, culminating in last night's debate, where the day before the debate, CNN published this. In a journalistic sense, I think pretty dubious story with a bunch of unnamed sources attributing this sexist remark to him. They then moderated the debate in this immensely partisan way, and then in the post-debate spin room, had a bunch of people, not a single pro-Sanders voice, a bunch of people talking about what a great debate it was for all the other candidates and how poorly he'd done. So this is about as partisan, as moderation can get, I think, in a kind of mainstream media setting.
So the question, what's then depending to this? I mean, what do we think is happening here, and why this attack on Sanders is so vociferous and strong at the moment? And what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I do think it is about trying to quell some of the excitement around Sanders' campaign. Specifically, I would also say that the concern is, if this is our candidate, what does it look like up against Trump? When so much around the conversation of socialism came up in 2016, and there was tremendous backlash and even greater division in the country around those concepts, that if he is the candidate, are we finding ourselves in the same spot and finding ourselves in a position where Trump will easily be able to walk into the White House again because so many people are reticent around issues of socialism?
So, but before I let you jump in here, because I want you to jump right in, but I want to play this piece because you raised the issue of socialism, Kimberly. I want to raise this piece about that when they asked him directly about socialism to kind of take him on about that, this is what Sanders had to say.
When Trump talks about socialism, what he talks about is giving hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks and subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. My democratic socialism says healthcare is a human right. We're going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. We're going to make public colleges and universities tuition free. We're going to have a Green New Deal and create up to $20 million saving the planet for our children and our grandchildren. We are going to take on the greed and corruption of the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance company. That is what democratic socialism is about, and that will win this election.
So clearly, this is an attack point from the establishment. I think it'll also be an attack point from the Republicans. I mean, if he becomes the candidate, it'll be a piece of this. So let's talk about politically what this might mean. Luke, and as someone who writes with Jacobin, let you take that on first.
Yeah, well, I mean, it will certainly be, if Sanders is the nominee, that will certainly be a line of attack against him by the Republicans. Although I think it's worth noting that that's been the line of, I mean, Republicans have been calling the most milquetoast centrist or even center-right Democrats, communists since as long as I can remember, as long as I started following American politics. It's true that I think that if you ask, the average voter whether they themselves identify as a democratic socialist, that's probably not a label that they themselves would ascribe to themselves. The socialist movement in the United States is growing, but it's still, far from a majority of the general population. But that doesn't mean at all that Sanders and his policy agenda isn't popular. In fact, the available evidence both suggests that it is very popular, and based on what we know, based on the conventional metrics going into a general election, Sanders does very well against Donald Trump. He's been defeating Donald Trump in hypothetical general election matchups throughout the past year, and I think there's a very good argument to be made that he is the best position of anyone in the Democratic field to win back crucial constituencies that cost the Democrats the last election, particularly non-voters and voters who supported Obama in 2008 and 2012 in Rust Belt states, and then switched to Trump, because that was I think in large part the reason for Donald Trump's Electoral College victory was flipping these key constituencies in a handful of states. That's how he was able to win lose the popular vote and win the general election. I think Sanders is arguably pretty well placed to reverse that trend.
But Mark, what I would say in response to that is, although the policies may be reflective of what many people personally feel in terms of their ideology, language matters, terminology matters. And if we're using terms like socialism, it does resonate with people in a particular way, which may run voters in another direction. And certainly, again, help reinforce or certainly give some fire to what Trump has been standing behind since 2016.
I think it deserves a really much deeper kind of conversation than we have time for today, just about how this fits into his campaign. I mean, clearly his ideas are something that grab a lot of people's attention because they're talking about a class fight in this country that people seem to really believe in. But this whole battle that they pushed that on purpose, I think, last night to kind of. Their attempt was not to raise his image, was to diminish his image.
That's right.
So, but there's other piece that happened last night as well, was the he said, she said, that Sanders allegedly said that a woman could not win. Let's take a look at this for a moment.
CNN reported yesterday that, and Senator Warren confirmed in a statement, that in 2018, you told her that you did not believe that a woman could win the election. Why did you say that?
Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't say it. And I don't want to waste a whole lot of time on this because this is what Donald Trump and maybe some of the media want. Anybody knows me, knows that it's incomprehensible that I would think that a woman could not be president of the United States. Go to YouTube today. There's a video of me 30 years ago talking about how a woman could become president of the United States.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election?
I disagreed. Bernie is my friend, and I am not here to try to fight with Bernie. But look, this question about whether or not a woman can be president has been raised, and it's time for us to attack it head on. And I think the best way to talk about who can win is by looking at people's winning record. So, can a woman beat Donald Trump? Look at the men on this stage. Collectively, they have lost 10 elections. The only people on this stage who have won every single election that they've been in are the women, Amy and me.
No matter what you think about this interchange, what's just happened to this politically, that was a great response, I thought.
It was.
But let's talk about what this might mean. I mean, on two levels. I mean, this clearly is a difference between two of them. If you saw at the end of the debate, she would not shake his hand. This, from all the reports I've read in some of the media about what happened in Iowa, that many of the young people who are torn between Warren and Sanders in Iowa are really torn about this issue. So how important is this? What is the media pushing? And how could this affect this election? Kimberly, I'll let you go first, and we'll go right to Luke.
Well, what the media is pushing is this divide between the two of them and making it an issue that we need to pay attention to instead of focusing on what's to happen in November. And that's the shift that Democrats haven't quite gotten to. And I've said this repeatedly, that we're still so caught up and tied to identity politics, in particular in this case around the issues of gender, that we get so embedded in those issues that it doesn't allow us to move forward and focus on what the big goal is. And the big goal is who's going to be the nominee and who's going to face head-to-head Donald Trump in November. And instead, here we are at the beginning of 2020, still having conversations about who that possible candidate may be and believing that conversations about who said what, when, is more important than focusing on the policies that they want to propose to beat Donald Trump.
I'm going to get to some of these policies before our time runs out, but Luke, I'm going to let you jump in on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think how people interpret this will really come down to, which candidate they were more inclined to favor already. I'm not sure that a lot of minds will be changed around this. I agree very much that this is the kind of thing, the corporate media in particular has, an immediate interest in kind of stoking and amplifying. I mean, much of the CNN post-debate spin had to do with this. They had their team of whatever it is, 30 analysts in one room dissecting the body language, over and over again and slowing it down and, things like that. I think all that's absurd. I personally find it extremely unlikely that Sanders made the remark as it's, as it was initially reported by CNN. If he did, it would fly in the face of kind of 30 or 40 years of public statements that he's made to the contrary, and it would also fly in the face of the fact that in 2016, he actually tried to talk Elizabeth Warren into running back then, but of course she demurred. I agree, it's the kind of thing that hopefully people won't focus on too much. The media's obsession with it notwithstanding, and hopefully, I'm not optimistic, but hopefully in the next few days it will just go away and we can get back to the more substantive debate ahead of the Iowa caucuses.
So let's look at this debate for a moment. Let's think one of the major issues here that kind of the debate focused on, which has to do with the foreign policy, Iran, and let's take a look at some of the things people said and the shifts that seems to be taking place in this debate.
I would leave some troops there, but not in the level that Donald Trump is taking us right now. Right. Afghanistan, I have long wanted to bring our troops home. I would do that.
We can continue to remain engaged without having an endless commitment of ground troops.
I think we need to get our combat troops out. You know, we have to stop this mindset that we can do everything with combat troops. Our military is the finest military on earth, and they will take any sacrifice we ask them to take. But we should stop asking our military to solve problems that cannot be solved militarily.
In America today, our infrastructure is crumbling. Half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. 87 million people have no health care or are underinsured. We got 500,000 people sleeping out on the streets tonight. The American people are sick and tired of endless wars, which have cost us trillions of dollars.
So clearly there's this new kind of anti-war stance, this powerful anti-war stance being taken by most of the candidates. And let me just show you this one more piece here. And then we're going to dive into what this might mean. And this is Biden, Joe Biden, talking about why you need to keep a limited number of troops there and the use of special forces and more.
I would leave troops in the Middle East in terms of patrolling the Gulf, where we are now, small numbers of troops. And I think it's a mistake to pull out the small number of troops that are there now to deal with ISIS. There's a difference between combat troops and leaving special forces in a position. I was part of the coalition that put together 68 countries to deal with stateless terror as well as failed states. Not us alone, 68 other countries. That's how we were able to defeat and end the caliphate for ISIS. They'll come back if we do not deal with them and we do not have someone who can bring together the rest of the world to go with us with small numbers of special forces we have to organize the effort to take them down.
So there we have Biden saying what he had to say with a lot of coded language that kind of about special forces and keeping troops there and the rest. But it's also this clear shift we're seeing with most candidates moving into an anti-war position. And there'll be a lot of talk, I know, about Trump and his sending more drones over than even Obama did, more troops there than were there when Obama left office. That was just tweeted out by Congressman Amash the other day, who's a Republican. And then there was this piece in the Huffington Post that was put out today, reminding us of what happened in 2003. And where the dialogue went something like this: I'll be with you on the condition we level the American people. We'll have to stay in Iraq a while. And George Bush says, you're right. And the senator says, if you can't get it done without staying, we'll give you the Nobel Peace Prize. I support you for president. And that senator was Joe Biden. So what is it? So let's talk about what we were saying about how this carries this campaign forward. Luke, let you start.
Well, I have two comments on those things. I mean, the first is I agree there's been a kind of marked rhetorical shift when it comes to foreign policy in the Democratic field. I mean, that's notable because there was a pretty strong bipartisan consensus around George Bush's foreign policy in the aftermath of 9/11. So it is notable to see that the kind of default position in the 2020 Democratic primary field is something different than that. I think people should be pretty skeptical about that. I mean, it was just last week that most of the candidates in the field, I would argue, besides Bernie Sanders, kind of criticized Trump for what he did in Iran, but or what he did in Iraq, rather, vis-a-vis Iran, but also sort of validated his narrative. They were very hesitant to criticize the premise of what he did. So the rhetorical shift is significant, but for now, I think it's largely a rhetorical one. You played the clip of Biden there, who did seem to be kind of the only candidate on the stage saying something else. I think one of the difficulties in assessing Biden in these debates is that he's so kind of sleepy and soporific, and he often kind of slurs his words. He's constantly shifting the tenses. And it can actually be very hard to tell what he intends to say. I think it's a really curious phenomenon that the nominal front runner in the primaries at this point is able to be so kind of incoherent in these debates that he's able to lie as he did last night about his position on rather his role in the events surrounding the invasion of Iraq, and it all just kind of goes unnoticed. I think that's a big problem and something people need to be thinking about more.
Kimberly?
I think our candidates are still trying to watch the polls and see exactly what it means to be pro or against war and how voters are looking at it, whether or not they want to see us in a full-fledged a war that requires more and more of our troops to go abroad, recognizing that in 2016, what seemed to be the tenor of the country is pull our troops home, bring them back. Let's not be a part of some of the conflicts that are happening abroad. And so this shift or this move, a very hasty move on Trump's part to do so when he did, has brought that issue back up. And candidates are trying to get a pulse of where do voters feel and think about this particular issue before they make an all-out stance to say, I am for or against. I do think some of the stances last night was leaning more towards anti-war in hopes of drawing supporters that think this is where we don't want to be again, and we've been here before, let's not repeat ourselves.
I think that the whole war issue and foreign policy is going to play a much bigger role than we think it's going to play in this coming general election. But there are other pieces here. Let's try to get to this before we have to end. And this has to do with the battle for the working class in America. And the working class in America is a deeply divided class at the moment. And often, there are large portions of the white working class that are behind Donald Trump. And huge portions of the working class, and especially Black and Latino members of the working class, are not backing Donald Trump, obviously. So, and there are two issues here. One is Medicare for all, and that debate around that. And the other is this trade deal, and what Sanders had to say about that. But let us start with a very quick look at the Medicare debate.
Let us be clear what Medicare for all does. It ends all premiums. It ends all copayments. It ends the absurdity of deductibles. It ends out-of-pocket expenses. It takes on the pharmaceutical industry, which in some cases charges us 10 times more for the same prescription drugs sold abroad as sold here. What we will do through a Medicare for all single payer program is substantially lower the cost of health care for employers and workers, because we end the $100 billion a year that the healthcare industry makes and the $500 billion a year we spend in the administrative nightmare of dealing with thousands of separate insurance plans.
To take Obamacare, reinstate, rebuild it, provide a public option, allow Medicare for those folks who want it, and in fact, make sure that we, in the process, reduce the cost of drug prices, reduce the cost of being able to buy into the subsidizes further, and make it everybody available to everyone. Here's the deal. That costs a lot of money. That costs $740 billion over 10 years. I lay out how I pay for that.
What I'm offering is a choice. You don't have to be in my plan if there's another plan that you would rather keep. And there's no need to kick Americans off the plans that they want in order to deliver health care for all.
And then you had Amy Klobuchar and others, Amy Klobuchar specifically, who had her own ideas about how this should work. And so let me just ask you both, this is one of the key issues here. Any of us, all of us, who have healthcare insurance, that don't have healthcare insurance, try to buy the pharmaceuticals that are costing too much money, just the rising costs, our deductibles and the rest, are very frustrated around healthcare issues in this country, dominated by the corporate world telling us what we can and cannot do. So how do we think this plays out, really in terms of the broader conversations for this coming debate? Because when you look at all the polls, it seems to me that people are really conflicted about Medicare for all. They want it. They're not sure how it's paid for. They're frightened of losing the coverage they have. They have good coverage. Right. So it's a major part of this debate, but clearly the Democrats have to figure out a way to get this message across, especially the Medicare for all people arguing for that have to figure out how to make this argument that they even popularizes this idea further. So Kimberly, let me start here, and we'll go to Luke.
Yeah, I think for many people, Medicare for All seems to scream even more government involvement, and that's what makes people so uncomfortable around issues of health care. While at the same time, Americans want choice, and they want to make the decisions that they want to make. So the idea that someone else would play a part of that is very uncomfortable for a lot of Americans. And so instead, we remain conflicted trying to figure out, yes, we do want to take some of the corporate monies and dollars out of our Medicare plans or out of our healthcare in general, because it is costing a lot of us a lot of money, even for those of us that have healthcare. I think about the recent hospitalization of my 15-year-old when he was there for an appendectomy, and after 10 days of service, we received a $26,000 hospital bill. Thank goodness for good healthcare, because my portion of that was $300. That is not the reality for a number of Americans.
Right.
But a lot of Americans would like to have access to that kind of support and health care, but they also don't want the government dictating to them who makes those decisions for them, who are their doctors on their behalf. They want to be able to maintain their private choice.
And it is a difficult question, and look, let me jump to you, who's talking from Toronto, that actually has a single-payer healthcare system that takes care of people. But, even Medicare for All here, when you have that here in the United States, people on Medicare have to buy anywhere from $100 to $400 a month worth of supplementals to ensure that they get coverage that doesn't cover things like hearing aids or other stuff that people need as they get older. So people are, I think, right to be nervous, but somebody's not making the argument strong enough to make people understand what this means.
Yeah, well, I think the fundamental thing to understand about the healthcare debate as it relates to the Democratic primary and the kind of wider American discourse around it is that the contours of that debate are set primarily by the powerful private interests and lobby groups who are feeding these talking points and have kind of successfully inserted various talking points and sound bites and kind of narratives about how Medicare for All would work into the public domain. They kind of fearmonger about how much it would cost, even though it would actually cost less as a share of GDP than the United States currently spends. They talk about there's this framing around choice, which I think is extremely misleading. You saw it last night with the way CNN kind of posed the questions around Medicare for All. Right? They will always ask, every major TV network will always ask, well, how are you going to pay for it? Can you afford to kick all these people off their private plans? Notice that in the war segment, they never ask, can we afford to, keep troops in the Middle East forever? They never ask the more centrist candidates, by creating a public option, aren't you creating, a two-tiered system where rich people get a better quality of health care than everybody else? Is that moral? They will never do that. So the whole framing of the debate is extremely slanted, and the goal of this kind of PR campaign against Medicare for All is to make the opportunity cost of a politician endorsing it in a full-throated way too high. Sanders is the only candidate who has kind of refused to bend the knee to this. Various other candidates, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, before that, kind of nominally endorsed Medicare for All before kind of acceding to, well, there are various paths to universality, or we're gonna have a complicated phase-in or something like that. I do just want to say one other thing as the resident Canadian on the show. And I have a perspective on the choice, the kind of choice frame as it comes up. No one in Canada, the government's not going to tell you under a single payer system which doctor you can see. And the Canadian healthcare system, by the way, doesn't cover everything. So it doesn't cover dental care, for example. I've had dental care through an employer plan in the past. If a politician had told me, hey, we're going to kick you off this plan and give you a state plan provided by the state, I would have said, great, that's fantastic. My plan doesn't cover everything. It's actually extremely difficult to use. It's a bureaucratic headache. I would rather just go to the dentist like I go to the doctor, and not have to worry about it. And I think that is the experience people would have under Medicare for All if it were to become reality. I think that's very important to understand.
It's a really important point. So let me close with this. So this is Bernie Sanders and others talking about the trade deal. And this is important because I want to dive for just a few minutes before we close into the question of the working class in America and the working middle classes in America who will decide this election, especially in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and whether we can cross this racial divide among working middle class people in our country. But let's watch this.
This deal, and I think the proponents of it acknowledge, will result in the continuation of the loss of hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs as a result of outsourcing. NAFTA, PNTR with China, other trade agreements were written for one reason alone, and that is to increase the profits of large multinational corporations.
I led the fight against the trade deal with Asia and the trade deal with Europe because I didn't think it was in the interests of the American people. This new trade deal is a modest improvement. Senator Sanders himself has said so. It will give some relief to our farmers. It will give some relief to our workers. I believe we accept that relief. We try to help the people who need help, and we get up the next day and fight for a better trade deal.
It is not so easy to put together new trade legislation. If this is passed, I think it will set us back a number of years.
And I support the USMCA. I am glad that these improvements were made.
It has been improved. It is not perfect. In my part of the country, in the industrial Midwest, I remember when they came around in the 90s, selling trade deals, telling us, don't worry about your slice of the pie. The pie will get so much bigger that everyone will be better off. And that promise was broken.
I don't know that there's any trade agreement that the senator would ever think made any sense. But the problem is that 95% of the customers are out there. So we better figure out how we begin to write the rules of the road, not China.
These trade deals have been exactly what Senator Sanders and Warren have been saying, which is that they've been designed to grow the American GDP for the corporations of America, not for the working people of America, and not to protect the climate.
So the question here becomes if Billy was the only one standing up against the trade deals because he thought they were anti-working class despite being pushed about the AFL-CIO supporting it and his retort to that. But it made me think of this larger question. He is speaking last night to the working class and middle class people of America and poor people in America, saying that we have to have a different way, that we can't continue like this. But we clearly see there's a divide in that group in America, and that divide is those around Trump, and a bunch of others are being pushed by the kind of racism in our country, and these larger working class issues. Can people like Sanders bring people together in the fall election? And what are your thoughts about that? Let's close with that. Kimberly, you want to start?
Sure. I do think we are at a space and time where someone like Sanders has an uphill battle regarding fighting against the master narrative of class issues in this country, because we have bought into the notion that there is no such thing as class that we're dealing with in our country, that if you just work hard, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, you too can be the next Donald Trump, right? I mean, that's a part of...
Your daddy gives you $14 million
well,
to kick it off with.
That certainly helps, right? But it is a part of so much ingrained in our narrative of who we are and how we understand ourselves, that the idea that he is now saying, but look, we're all in this together and we have a common experience that we need to have a conversation about, is very hard for people to embrace and understand. And at the core of that, although we'd like to believe it is not, is still very much about race, because Black and white, in particular, working class people do see themselves very different from each other and don't see that as a common experience that they are having, because when you're looking at working class Blacks and you're looking at working class whites, they do seem to at least perform differently than one another. So the idea that we're in this together doesn't seem possible.
And yeah, we're lacking one piece that we used to have as a former tenant organizer and as a former union organizer back in the day. That's what bridged the gap sometimes, bringing people together because they had a common thing to fight
right.
Against those who would oppress them. So, but look, let me let you have the final word on this.
Well, going off what Kimberly said, I mean, I think that is the ultimate test of the Bernie Sanders theory of change, right? His aspiration is to create a multiracial working class coalition around this transformative policy agenda. It's something that I think, he understands is very difficult, but also necessary. And I think it's something many of us believe is really the only path to transformative change in the United States that exists. I mean, this is a country with deeply a deep history of racism. It's a country where money basically controls everything. It's a country where, as was just said, there are particular narratives around individual achievement that are often seen as kind of antithetical to collective solidarity and things like that. And so this is the test of the Sanders campaign. And this will be the main test that he faces if, somehow he overcomes the kind of stuff that we saw last night and manages to win the Democratic nomination. It'll be very interesting to see.
Well, Luke Savage, Kimberly Moffat, thank you both so much for being with us today. It's been a great conversation. I will continue covering this election 2020. Thank you both and have a great day.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
And thank you all for watching. Let us know what you think. I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.